Hi, everyone. For today's lectures about weird folk around the world, I decided to hang out with this jaguar. It is from the Mayan people, and you can find it in the National Archaeological Museum in Mexico City, the capital of Mexico. So this jaguar is going to help me out with the lecture today. All right, my friends, let's talk about weird folks around the world. We commonly think about the werewolf, but I want to talk about all of the different examples from other cultures around the world, which are illuminating and interesting and just plain cool. So let's get started. And a reminder, we are talking today about therianthropy. Therianthropy is the ability for humans to morph into some kind of animal, human hybrid, or even into animals themselves. So in the Western tradition, this is the werewolf, but in many other cultural traditions, we see therianthropy in other kinds or in other ways. And so we're going to talk about those various ways today. However, we do see some werewolves in non-Western cultures, and then we also see other were animals, but there are some common themes. First of all, these are almost always connected to concepts of hunting or death, and again, connected to the moon. And they all represent in some way man's struggle to be in touch with nature. And I mean, to a certain extent, humanity's struggle to be in touch with nature, but I also mean that there's a certain masculine element. And so in many cases, we really are talking about man's struggle to be in touch with nature. Remember how we talked about how the moon and werewolves is supposed to replicate the female menstrual cycle in similar ways. A lot of the were examples we're going to talk about here have to deal with man's connection to nature. So one of the examples that I love is from ancient Egypt, and this is an early example. The ancient Egyptians lived about 4,000 years ago, all the way up to 2,000 years ago, so for quite a long span. And they are a polytheistic people, or they were a polytheistic people, which means that they had multiple gods. In ancient Egyptian religion, gods were half man, half beast, and they were represented by different beasts. So Anubis was the king of the afterlife and the god of embalming, and he was represented as half man and half jackal or dog. So he is the closest example of a were creature in ancient Egyptian mythology. He is also one of the most powerful and well-respected gods in the ancient Egyptian pantheon. So here is this idea of the jackal man or the wolf man. Now, if we go to another ancient civilization, let's go to the Mayans. The Mayans in Mesoamerica have the Nagual, and the Nagual exists in, to a lesser extent, like Olmec and Aztec mythology, but it was huge in Mayan mythology. And the Nagual is a shapeshifter. So it is a man who is able to shift into the form of various animals in order to interact with the gods. Mayan culture was also polytheistic, so there were multiple gods. Some were human, some were animal. So Naguals were shapeshifters that could interact with the gods by shifting from one human form to an animal form, or one animal form to another animal form. The most common form that they would shapeshift into was the jaguar or the puma, but also lesser creatures such as snakes, antelope, other smaller animals. In addition, we have further north from Mesoamerica, we have what would be today the United States and Canada, and there were several Native American traditions which included the skinwalker. And the skinwalker is a therianthrope, is a metamorph who is also kind of a witch. And so this is seen as a somewhat like dangerous and disturbing character. And the skinwalker was a witch who would actually put on the skins of animals and then transform or morph into that animal. And so its name translates, we call them skinwalkers in English, but the Native American name in many languages would translate into he who walks on all fours, he who is one of the animals, etc. And so it's kind of a witch character, kind of a were character. They often were depicted as wolves, though, so it is kind of an interesting metamorph version of the werewolf. Heading over to Europe, we talked last time about Scandinavians and their werewolf stories, but I also wanted to talk about the Finnish werebear, and that is Ukko. Ukko is the sky god, and he is the all-powerful god of things like weather and lightning and thunder, but also clouds and the night sky. When he is angry, lightning strikes the earth and he transforms into a man bear. So a giant bear beast that walks around and fucks stuff up, like, because he's angry, right? And we have Uko cults all the way back to Neanderthals. We have examples in their art and examples in Northern European burial rituals, all the way back before we're even human, that depict Uko, the angry man bear god. So this is a really, really ancient figure for us to think about as a were creature or a metamorph. Let's swap over to Africa. So Africa has the legend of the leopard man. And this, when I say Africa, I'm not trying to say like all Africans are the same thing or there's only one African culture. There are tons and tons of different African cultures. And so there are lots of different examples of this myth. But myth exists across many, many sub-Saharan African cultures, just with slight variance on it. And so this is the idea of the magical man who is actually a manifestation and who morphs into the leopard or the, big cat, essentially. And these are elites. These are powerful men within their societies. They are magical. But in some of the legends, they are actually animals themselves who morph into men in order to basically like tell the story of the animals and ensure the protection of the animals. In other cases, these legendary figures are just men who wear the skins of leopards and morph into leopards in order to protect their people. Today, many sub-Saharan African tribes across the continent in multiple cultures, multiple linguistic systems have this concept of the leopard skin chief, the powerful or prominent chief figure who wears the skins of animals that have been killed, particularly big cats. So leopards, or sometimes in some cases lions. So these are symbolically the leopards of their community in charge of hunting, killing the enemies, protecting the people, etc. Now, some of you are like, so wait a second, is like the Black Panther legend, like the superhero, like the comic book, like, is that just drawing on pre-existing sub-Saharan African beliefs about men morphing into cats and like exuding this power and actually being metamorphs, turning into these big cat beasts? Yes. Yes, that's exactly where the Marvel MCU comic, right? The comic book and then eventually the film gets this idea of the man morphing into the Black Panther. It already exists in African folklore, the idea of the man morphing into the leopard and being the chief of his people. So like Black Panther like totally makes sense within African folklore. Like it's a comic book, now a film, but it's also African folklore come to life. And finally, let's switch over to a few of the Asian examples. When we're talking about the Asian examples, and there are multiple of them and I'm going to review them, they are tigers. So it is not that people transform into werewolves, they transform into were-tigers, which is the biggest predatory beast that we see in Southeast Asia. So in India, we actually have were-tigers who are witches or sorcerers who morph into tigers in order to be aggressive or violent within the community. We also have the Chinese. Now remember, the Chinese have their like witch vampire character, right? The Jiangxi, which are people who are not buried properly and thus become these kind of zombie vampire corpses. Well, China also has the idea of people who have been turned into ghosts. Again, concerns about how bodies are dealt with at the end of their times, right? When they become corpses, right? And so bodies that are not handled properly and are eaten by tigers, or even people who are attacked and killed by tigers. In both those cases, their ghosts will come back, according to Chinese folklore, as were-tigers, as actually a cross between humans and tigers, and these angry ghost spirits of people who were fucked up, either their corpses or while they were alive, by tigers, go around and cause problems and haunt people as these were-tigers. In addition, we see something similar in Thailand. If you are eaten by a tiger in Thailand, it is believed you will come back from the dead as a were-tiger and run through the jungles in rage. So when people see a tiger in Thailand out in the jungle, they're like, was that once a man? is he a man now? So there's this weird kind of conception that tigers are like hyper intelligent because they are actually filled with the spirits of people who were eaten by tigers and became were-tigers themselves. But my favorite example of the were-tiger from Asia is from Indonesia, and that's the harimau jaidan. And the harimau jaidan are magical beings. They are men of wisdom and knowledge, and they morph into tigers at night. But they do this on purpose. They do this to protect the livestock of the community from other wild animals. However, because they are out at night and like crime happens at night, sometimes the harimau jaidan see crime and they have to avenge it. So sometimes they also act as like revenge bringers or like vigilantes for the community. So they are talked about as bringers of justice. And these are very positive figures. They are not looked upon as a curse or as dangerous to society. They are looked upon as protectors. So like they protect women who are walking alone at night and protect them from rapists, or they protect the community and the livestock from animals or outsiders. So they are the bringers of nighttime justice and the protectors of the community. So they're not a bad character. In fact, they are magical, beloved characters in Indonesian society. And then finally, a slightly different example, but one that I love them so much I can't help but talk about them, and that is the kitsune. Kitsune are characters in Japanese Shinto mythology. That's the folk animistic religion of Japan. And the Japanese believe that foxes are people, and that foxes morph into people and people morph into foxes. And these foxes are kitsune. So the Japanese word for fox is kitsune. But kitsune are believed to be magical. So all foxes are believed to be magical in Japanese society. They're believed to be tricksters, you know, sly like a fox. So the Japanese actually believe that they are long-living kind of prankster characters. This is the Japanese archetype of the jester or joker character. This is their equivalent of Loki, right? Are the kitsune. And the kitsune are smart, they're devious, sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. They also are messengers that connect the Shinto gods to the people, so they bring messages back and forth. And so in a lot of Shinto temples, you will see statues of foxes. That's because they are believed to be in statue form now, but they will come to life as little kitsune and bring messages from the people to the gods. And so they're tricksters, but it's not always bad. Like it's good that they're half in, half out, and that they can turn to stone sometimes, or they can do magical things. The older a kitsune is, the more tails it has. And so kitsune are often depicted having multiple tails. That's a sign that they are an old, wise fox doing important magical things. And actually, in Japanese society, if you call a woman kitsue gao, if you say, oh, you're fox-faced, that's actually a compliment. It means that you're both pretty, but also that like you're clever and spiritual. So saying, oh, kitsune gao, like, oh, you have such a pretty fox face. That's actually a compliment. So this idea that like a pretty woman might even have a little bit of kitsune in her kind of, you know, resonates in Japanese society. All right, guys, thank you very much. I hope you found this lecture about therianthropy and all of the different were creatures from around the world super interesting. Thanks for listening, guys.